it struck me that in contrast to that, a lot of philosophy in the more contemporary West is not only not preoccupied with issues of manners and civility, but in many cases disdains them.
Do you get aroused by stimulating intellectual conversation? Are you turned on by the idea of engaging with thought leaders from across the United States? Do you go gaga over exploring important ideas from influential books, research, and essays? Then welcome to Curiosity Porn, the place you can satisfy all those intellectual urges guilt-free. Your hosts are Dr. Guy Crane, Professor of Philosophy at Rose State College, and Professor James Davenport, Professor of Political Science at Rose State College. However, the views expressed here are solely the views of the hosts and their guests and do not reflect the views of Rose State College, its administration, faculty, or students. And now, here are James and Guy. Good afternoon, Guy Crane. How are you?
Hello, James. I'm hot. You know what I'm not a fan of? The summer.
It has gotten a little toasty here in Oklahoma.
2 out of 5 stars. Would not recommend.
It is, yeah. You know, I was spent a week up in Massachusetts at the end of May.
I remember you saying you were going to go up there.
And that was pretty nice weather.
I was very jealous.
But now I'm back here, and it is even warmer than when I left.
Is it a productive summer? You had the conference. Is it a productive summer for you?
It's getting there. It's getting there. I rearranged my office the other day, and so it gives me a little bit more space, a little bit better flow when people come in. So I did that, and I got me a nice little whiteboard that I can start tracking some of my projects a little bit more effectively.
I probably need one of those. That sounds like a good idea.
Yeah. So we will see if I can. I've broken out into some organization this last week or two. We'll see if that lasts.
You and I co-teach, so I know this is an area of growth for you.
Huge growth, right? Or at least needed growth. I don't know if I can say I've made huge strides just yet. But we have a wonderful guest on today's program.
Ecstatic about our guest.
Guy, you have been bragging about and raving about this guest for a while.
Yes, I have.
And so why don't you introduce who we have with us, and we'll get rolling.
Yes, our guest today is Dr. Amy Olberding. Amy is the President's Associate's Presidential Professor of Philosophy at the University of Oklahoma. Her area of specialization is early Chinese philosophy, ethics, and philosophical approaches to mortality. She's the author of numerous scholarly articles and books. I tried to make a list, and it was just ridiculous. There's no way I was going to read all those out. And I can personally attest, she is an excellent classroom teacher. Just fantastic. I took her as an undergrad, actually. We've invited her here today to talk about her book, The Wrong of Rudeness. Amy, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here.
Now, before we get into the heart of what we're here to discuss, we have some kind of rapid fire, going to get to know you questions so we can kind of better get a feel for you. Our audience can. All right. So question number 1, how did you get into academia? What led you to the classroom, so to speak?
I stumbled into it backwards, sort of.
I'm already liking this guest.
I dropped out of high school and then tried to finish with a correspondence course and found out I could go to college on a kind of probationary status in Louisiana back then. And so I did that. And I really liked reading and studying, but not all of the going to class and taking tests. So I dropped out of college for a while and then eventually made my way back into college, a different college, and took a philosophy class and really, really liked it. So I got a bachelor's degree in philosophy, and then worked for a couple of years as a maid, as a library attendant, and thought I might as well go to grad school because I liked studying and I might as well study more. I didn't know how hard academia was. And then I just went into graduate school and I gradually figured out how things work, I guess. I got really lucky because I didn't know how hard it was. I tried anyway. So I just liked philosophy and kept taking courses, and now here I am.
Seems to have worked out.
Well, you're leaving out a part very near and dear to mine and James's heart. Wasn't your first academic gig at a community college?
It was. And I loved that. While I was writing my dissertation, my husband was in graduate school in Chicago, and I got a job at a community college out in the western suburbs. And I did a lot of teaching, most of it intro to ethics and intro to philosophy, and just loved it because the students were coming at it from all different directions. And so the discussions were really lively and chaotic, like in that way where I would find out new things. I mean, if we're doing environmental ethics, and then I'd have a toilet salesman in the class who could talk about low flush toilets and why they don't sell. And you just don't get that at the 4-year university, people with, knowledge from all kinds of walks of life. So I loved that.
Tell us one interesting thing you're currently either reading, listening to, or watching. Your pick.
I'm currently reading a biography of Thomas More. I kind of got into reading English history just a little bit backwards. I read Hilary Mantel's novels about Thomas Cromwell, and then I didn't know anything about English history. So I started reading some English histories, and then I, from there, managed to pick up this biography of Thomas More, and it's kind of turned into this mythic book because I keep misplacing it. And he's only in his adolescence, so I don't know if the book is any good. I've had it for about a month. I've been trying to read it, but I usually don't lose books, but I keep losing it. And so in my head, I'm thinking, Thomas More, he's got to get out of his adolescence. So I'm going to have to hunker down. And really, it's good so far. What do you know about medieval childhood? It's interesting. So, yeah.
All right. Who do you think is the greatest philosopher of all time?
I have no answer to this, except I hope that he or she has not been born yet. I hope it's somebody coming down the pike.
Good answer. I like that.
Let me ask it a different way. Who are the, 2 or 3 philosophers that you really have influenced your thinking?
That's a lot easier. I would say the Confucians, Kongzi and Xunzi, both of them. Seneca, because he's just fun to read, and Montaigne. Those are the. If I were on a desert island, those are the 4 I would take.
There you go. Guy was really hoping you would say that you're the greatest philosopher of all time was Plato. He loves Plato.
False. This is not what I think at all. I dread the day in our class that I got to teach Plato. Ugh. Amy, what's one thing about your work you wish people understood better?
That I'm doing it by the seat of my pants. That if there's mistakes and objections, then okay. I don't get into the trying to make philosophy super sewed up tight. I would rather be kind of make interesting mistakes than get every small detail right. So, yeah, I guess just reading it with the sense that, I'm just trying to figure stuff out too, just like we all are. And that means making mistakes. So
exploration can be messy, right? I mean, if you're really interested in ideas and you're really interested in where they can lead you, trying to constantly put them in some kind of very cohesive framework can get difficult sometimes.
But I can attest to what she's talking about. I mean, Amy, isn't it right? Like, we're not always rewarded for that kind of exploratory work in philosophy. Like, it's a lot easier to get a publication if you've got 2 or 3 if and only ifs in the paper and lists of necessary and sufficient conditions and that sort of thing.
Yeah, yeah. A lot of philosophy reads like it's written from a defensive crouch, like you're just trying to guard against objections. And if you're going to guard against objections and have something that you can, think is going to be minimally exposed to objections, you're going to have to like crouch lower and lower and make it smaller and smaller. And I wish we wouldn't do that. I think it'd be better to gesture at things and get them wrong than to pin them down and just be stuck with the small things that work that way.
All right, last one of these. What's a belief that you hold that puts you at odds with either your peers, colleagues, or family?
Well, those groups are very different in some respects. So, there are views I have that my neighbors would think are, just absolute nuts and outrageous, and that my colleagues would think are just obvious and true. Yeah. So I think I have a happy diversity of acquaintances. So there isn't any one thing that if everybody I knew that they would, cancel me or something like that. Instead, I think they're, there's no one thing like that, I think.
I will proffer something that I just found it hilarious that you said. This was when we were at Philosophy Day, right? At UCO just a few months ago. And I had to struggle not to just belly laugh that you actually admitted you don't like a lot of Asian philosophy, despite being a scholar in Asian philosophy.
Yes. Yes. It was a panel on why I love Asian philosophy. I didn't know that was the title going in. And I just had to admit, like, I don't. I mean, I've got some philosophers I like, but, students, at least in Oklahoma, assume that if you teach Asian philosophy, that you love everything Asian. And they have a very imprecise idea of what that is. So the students will ask me if I meditate and things like that. And, I hate meditating. I don't ever, I just, like, I can't stand it. Or they'll want to know like where the best Chinese food is or something like that. And that's not your area of expertise. And that is not my area of expertise. Or they'll want to know something about the communist revolution or something. And everything like Chinese history is thousands of years. I don't know all of it. I just don't. So, yeah.
I do remember all those years ago being in your undergrad class, which I still have to brag about. You are, side note, still to this day, probably one of the best chalk and talk teachers I've ever seen. That is not my jam. I am not good at it. But you were just so good at it. And I remember the longer and longer you went on in the class on the unit on Buddhism, you had like 2 or 3 students who were desperate for you to talk about the Dalai Lama, which was just an absolute red herring compared to what we were covering at the time. I thought that was fun. That must be kind of what you're talking about.
Yeah. Where it's just anything. I mean, and this is just a function of our education system in terms of like world history, world cultures and so forth, is that it becomes this one kind of amorphous blob. And so, whatever kind of idea is just the name Asia sets off, students think that it's all one thing. And I hope, when I teach that class that has Indian philosophy and Chinese philosophy and so forth, I'm struggling always to say like India and China, they're different things. They're different entities, different traditions. There was no contact between them in the period we're talking about, but some students just, want to roll it all together and throw in Tibet and yeah.
Well, yeah, let's pivot and talk about that. What you actually are a scholar in. Your book is entitled The Wrong of Rudeness. How did this come about? Like, what inspired you? I take it you think there's something about civility and rudeness that's especially relevant to our current, or at least our recent political and social climate. Am I right?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I had kind of, it started primarily because, I do all this work on early Confucianism, and they cared so much about manners and civility that you can't help but at least from the standpoint of someone, alive now and with a Western background, can't help but think, what was that about? Right? Like they were really, really uncommonly preoccupied by this. So I was interested in it from that vantage point. But then it struck me that in contrast to that, a lot of philosophy in the more contemporary West is not only not preoccupied with issues of manners and civility, but in many cases disdains them and is not at all interested. And meanwhile, the civic relationships around us are in flames and burning to the ground. And it seemed to me that philosophers ought to have something to say about that. That we ought not just be propounding about huge moral issues, but about how to discuss disagreement, how to discuss values without coming to blows and so forth, or even just everyday moral treatment. I mean, I think good manners are a moral issue. And I think that's something that we have neglected in contemporary ethics, contemporary Western lineage ethics.
So you saw a gap in the literature, but were there any particular, political or newsworthy events that inspired sort of the shape of the book?
Some of it was just the ugliness of the rhetoric in the 2016 election. I mean, I was already kind of working on it then. I also had been to, there was a conference where, I had just kind of, as an aside, I was giving a paper on rudeness, and I had made an aside, saying, well, philosophers are rude. And I just took that as a given that philosophers are rude. And I realized that people were shocked by that. And I thought, well, why is that, why is that shocking? Because it seemed to me, especially in online spaces, philosophers are terrible people. And so, I can't pinpoint any particular events or episodes in recent history, except to say that it felt to me like there was a kind of steady coarsening of our civic discourse. And that it was going beyond things like, I remember the State of the Union address where one representative, yelled in the middle of Obama's speech. I found that incredibly shocking at the time, just because there was, to my knowledge, there wasn't any precedent for somebody doing that. And it seemed like there were repeatedly episodes like that of things that seemed just, off the table as ways to behave, all of a sudden appearing and becoming normalized. And of course, since then, that's really just run away with us. So,
to defend civility, you rely, as you kind of alluded to, on the work of early Confucian philosophers. And some people might find that a little surprising. I'm sure a lot of people have this stereotype of Confucius kind of sitting on a hilltop, giving calm, sage advice in peaceful conditions. But what were the actual social and political climate of the early Confucians like compared to ours?
They make our conditions look like a walk in the park, really. Confucius' life transpires, and then his later followers, right at this pivot point in early Chinese history, where the Zhou dynasty was basically faltering, and it gives way to what's called the Warring States period. And it's called the Warring States period because you effectively have these feudal territories vying with each other, each for dominance and territory. Different warlords effectively conquering each other. Many of them trying to claim the title king. And so you have this period of violence, conflict, uncertainty, instability, and famine. Right, all the things that go with warfare. And, in that period, you go from having a whole bunch of different states being, condensed into the Qin dynasty at the very end of it, because it's just been wars of conquest with each conquering another. The philosophers during this time in early China are not on mountaintops. They're down in the muck trying to secure positions as political advisors. So they recognize that the world is going horribly wrong, and they want to, put a hand in and try to improve it. And the way to do that is to get the ear of someone with power. So the Confucians are trying to, become political advisors. And, Confucius' students are training with him in part in order to be able to secure political positions. And, some of them die for it. Some of them become corrupted. Their rivals in this are figures like Sun Tzu, the military theorist. The Moists are another group of philosophers, and they effectively worked as philosophers and as military advisors. They would go to states that were under aggressive attack and help defend them, and developed all kinds of military technologies for doing this. So the philosophers were not peacefully on mountaintops talking, nor were they, like the Romans, sort of laying around chatting. This was very deeply about what kind of world people would live in, and how one, as a philosopher, could try to influence that. Even though, of course, it was a dangerous way to live. Their passages in the Analects where, Confucius and his students are running for their lives. So it's dangerous.
That does make it all the more surprising that they were so fixated on manners, right? You would think with that kind of political instability, manners might seem to them like, I don't know, we don't have the luxury to worry about something like that right now, right? And before we go on, like we keep using these terms, manners, civility. You use several of those terms throughout the book: civility, manners, rudeness, etiquette. You point out that there's important conceptual differences in how we in the West think of these terms compared to the Confucians. Can you spell out some of those differences and then how you ultimately end up using those terms yourself?
Yeah, I mean, the Confucians, all these English terms, civility, etiquette, manners, are all kind of covered by one term in the Confucian text, li. But our division of these terms, I think, comes about in part because of relatively recent history, 18th, 19th century, where you have this idea of public sphere and the political behavior that belongs within it, right? And how one's public face should look, in contrast with the manners that one needs, for the home and for entertaining and so on. In my book, I mostly leave civility aside, because one of the problems that I think comes with that is that in our contemporary context, when we talk about civility, we think of it as explicitly the kind of norms that govern political disagreements between people. And that's a very thin idea. I think that there are all kinds of behaviors that are in the same family with that. So I tend to stick to manners and etiquette. And I talk about manners as, there's some really big values that have to be captured in the norms we have. You've got to respect other people, show consideration, and basically have a pro-social orientation, where you see, kind of one of our obligations as human beings is to try to cooperate with each other, or to be available to cooperate with each other. And those big values are something that we would expect any code of manners to try to instantiate and to embrace. Etiquette is just the rules for doing that. And Miss Manners, or Judith Martin, has a good example of this, right? Like that the values of manners will tell you that you should show respect in a house of worship. But how you do that, what are the actual rules, that's etiquette. And the etiquette's going to differ depending on what kind of house of worship you're in. So if the big goal is to show respect in the house of worship, in some cases, the etiquette will be to take off your hat. In other cases, it will be to cover your head. And which one of those rules attaches is going to be context dependent and will depend on the conventions where you are. So when I talk about etiquette, I'm talking about the rules. Just the what are the actual behaviors that show respect and communicate respect or consideration? And manners are just those broad values that you're trying to convey.
When I hear the discussions of these, I often think back to George Washington's Rules of Civility, which is a very interesting read if someone hasn't read it. Of course, it's bound by its time period and things, but some of it you'll get a good chuckle of thinking about why in the world would he need to say that, right? But that's I think in some ways that's kind of the idea. This was kind of outward facing. How do you show respect to other people you're interacting with in a certain way?
Yeah, I recommend it too. It's wonderful to read.
Amy, you write that it's hard to be polite, but tempting or at least easier to be rude. Why do you think that is?
Well, since then I think I may have made a mistake with that, because it was pointed out to me that philosopher Alice McLaughlin pointed out that, maybe that's true for some people and some temperaments. There are other people with different temperaments where the easiest thing is to go along and to be polite and to be pleasant. So maybe it's not easier for everybody to be rude, but for some of us, it's easier not to have to engage in self-restraint, to be able to just say what you think, to not, worry about tact, to just be free, and, say what you see, say what you think. I just think that there's effort in, instead of just, in a kind of unfiltered way, communicating what I think or feel, instead allowing what I think or feel to be shaded in accord with how other people are going to receive that, and trying to shape it in accord with how they're going to receive it. That's more effort. So it is easy to me. It's easier to be rude.
I certainly think in the social media environment that we're in today, that people who might be inherently inclined to be more rude has a mechanism that allows them to do that without any of the guardrails that you have if you're in face-to-face communication, right? It's much easier for me to bang out an insult or say something that's rather mean-spirited when I'm not sitting right across from the person. And so I certainly think that in the internet world that we're in the social media environment that so many of us are in, that I don't know that I would say it has made us more rude, but it has certainly revealed to us the inherent rudeness of many of us that are out there.
Yeah, I think that's one of those questions, I guess, for people doing empirical work, whether that was always there or whether it's been created. But I agree, it certainly, it feels like it's changed, like something new has been loosed on the world.
Sure. All right, I have to point out that you really scored some points with me when I realized that one of your intellectual sparring partners in this book is Jean-Jacques Rousseau, for those who don't know, the 18th century philosopher. And any day that Rousseau is revealed to be wrong about something is a good day for me, because I think there's so much flaws in his writing. But nonetheless, but Rousseau tries to make this case against civility and good manners. And tell us what's wrong about his what is his problem with those, and what does he get wrong about civility?
For me, at least, the way Rousseau writes about it is as if it is purely and only about repression of, kind of the more attractive underlying natural self. At times Rousseau can suggest that, well, he even has a line in there about, it sort of stifles his genius or something, right? To engage in the kind of repression and restraint that good manners require. And I think that's a relatively common complaint about manners is that you're having to fake it, right? You're having to fake attitudes you don't hold, emotions you don't feel, and be pleasant when you feel anything but. And so it can feel like a false self or a mask that you're wearing. And I think Rousseau thinks, like tear off the mask and then you'd actually get to know people and that would be attractive. And I think he thinks that there's sort of a self underneath waiting to be revealed. And I think it's in some ways it's more individualistic because there is that sense of myself can't be expressed if I'm practicing these shared norms. And I agree that with him that in many ways manners do require a mask. I'm just less confident about what you see when you tear that mask off. You're right, that it's not this beautiful woodland creature, but the swamp monster from the deep or something. So yeah.
Yeah, it reminds me of that saying, people always say, hey, just be yourself. And I'm like, unless you're a jerk, then be somebody else, right?
I was just thinking that's a very handy card to play. If anybody ever calls you out for your rudeness, you can just be like, listen, do not stifle my genius here.
That's right.
Yeah.
So James here, just last year, he wrote a piece for Non-Doc about the need for civility. And I'd like to read a quote to you from it. James writes, at virtually all levels of our country's democracy, partisans, the most loyal Democrats and Republicans, increasingly loathe one another. Political scientists call it affective polarization. The idea there is that, like, even in cases where members of both parties agree on policy issues or where there really isn't much of a gap between the positions they take, they just plain dislike each other more now than in previous years. They don't want to live near each other. They don't want their children intermarrying. This is what came to mind when I was reading the section of your book where you talk about the way early Confucians thought about the importance of funerary practices. You argue that the way that they thought about corpses could give us valuable insight for how to deal not only with other people in general, but as you call them, scare quotes, those people. Can you talk about that? Can you explain that?
Yeah, I mean, let me see if I can condense it well. So this is the Confucian philosopher Xunzi, and he has this kind of pessimistic take on what's under the mask. I mean, he thinks human beings are prone to being selfish, to contention, to strife. I mean, he has this kind of Hobbesian state of nature thing where we're just, ugly underneath. And when he says our nature is bad, the term he's using has an aesthetic shade, like just detestable, right? I mean, but when he's talking about funerary ritual, the Confucians took this very seriously. And he talks about how, with the corpse, the core element of funerary ritual is disposal of the corpse. That's one of the main functions that has to be accomplished in bereavement. And he kind of acknowledges that the corpse, it's foul, right? It's decaying matter. And yet the nature of grief is such that we don't want to treat it as merely foul matter. It is also symbolically a person that we have cared about. It's symbolically a human being. And so he sees there's these two elements. There's the personhood of the corpse, and there's the foul matter aspect of it, decaying matter. And effectively what Xunzi says is, funerary ritual is designed to try to promote the positive part and reduce the negative part. If you're exposed to something that is disgusting and decaying, you develop contempt for it. And so in dealing with a corpse, we want to conceal those parts of the reality. We want to ornament the corpse. We want to, sort of perfume it and so on, so that we can gradually, sort of take our leave of it as we must. We will have the good feeling. We will, in a sense, try to amplify the humanity of the corpse and try to reduce our exposure to its material awfulness. I think you can, with Shunz's account, I think you can think of living human beings like that. That, human beings are also disgusting, foul creatures. And we want what we want. We want our own desires fulfilled. We're ready to trample on each other.
I was just saying that about Guy before we started. I'm just saying.
Yeah. So there's this sense of, to my mind, it's right. Anybody who's had an experience where you're in a public place and you have some kind of episode or encounter with other people and you leave the experience saying, oh, people, right? Where people is a term of disgust. That's what Shunza wants to avoid. He thinks there's a truth to it, but it's a truth we want to conceal. And we want to engineer our social conditions to favor the positive part of humanity, our capacity to cooperate, our capacity to coexist with each other, to navigate resources in common, and so on. And the way that you do that is with manners. So using one of my examples, right? We form lines in coffee shops instead of everybody just shoving to get ahead. And when we form a line in a coffee shop, everybody is ornamenting their desire to have my coffee right now. I don't care about you, right? They're concealing it. They're ornamenting it. And because of that, we can have a more positive sense of humanity than we do when somebody cuts in line at the coffee shop. So Shunza's idea is that when we're exposed to each other's just raw desires and self-interest, it's like getting a whiff of the corpse, right? It's getting a sense of how base people can be, how foul they can be to each other. And we want to conceal that. And we conceal it with manners. And with manners, we can actually come to cooperate and so on. That's a very condensed version of that. But
no, that's helpful. Thank you. I want to read just a great quote from your book that I love so much. You write, "The models of manners and civility the Confucians endorse reaches for nobility by way of the banal and the ordinary. The big stuff is won through the little stuff." I really like that quote. When I read it, I thought about how so many standard textbooks for college level ethics classes are full of like huge global scale issues like war, pollution, the death penalty. They almost never say anything. There's not a chapter on like basic anger management, or maybe you shouldn't cover your car with angry bumper stickers. I don't know if that's quite what you had in mind with that quote, but either way, can you expand on what you mean by the big stuff is won through the little stuff?
Yeah, I think that the Confucians, and I think they're right about this, recognize that sort of habit and moral emotional shaping is what we need more than a lot of moral life transpires below the level of decisions, right? So in our day-to-day lives, we're encountering other people at such a pace and frequency that we're not consciously deciding how to treat them. We need instead to be, habituated and disposed in particular ways to treat other people well. And we need to have certain kinds of attention to other people in order to make them feel morally recognized. I'm surprised by how many of my students, if I ask them for an example of rudeness, one of the things that comes up the most often is being on campus and somebody letting a door slam in your face when they walk through it, right? Not holding the door that little bit extra so that it doesn't close in your face. That really bothers people. And I think it bothers people because it makes them feel unseen as human beings. And it corrodes your sense of yourself. It can corrode your sense of shared humanity with other people, and so on. And I agree with you about the textbooks. One of the best experiences I had with this was doing Kant in one of my intro to ethics classes at the community college. And we were talking about Kant on lying. And of course, there's the example of Kant wants us never to lie. And the example is always of this, the murderer at the door. You have his victim, his wanted victim in your basement. The murderer wants to know where his victim is, and you're supposed to tell the truth. And that's this high stakes, high drama example. And one of my students, I learned a lot from this student. One of my students said, I just don't think that's a very compelling example. And I was like, okay, well, what's a better one? And she said, well, my grandma has cancer, and she's always really cared a lot about her appearance. And she just, she's having chemo, she's lost her hair, and she's gotten a new wig. And she asked me how it looks. Does it look as good as her hair used to look? And she's like, I don't know what to say. It doesn't look as good. But that seems like the wrong thing to say. And the Confucians, I think, would agree, like that's a moral moment. But it's not one that's well captured in some kind of principled decision-making mechanism that's, do I lie or do I not? It's nested in a whole host of particulars, but it's small, but it's everything, right? Do we lie to our grandmothers about their chemo wigs or not? That's a small matter, but it's also one of life's more important things, I would think.
Are you preparing that chapter that answers that question for the next ethics anthology for classroom use?
That would be nice. I don't think there's one particular answer for that. I think the temperament of the grandma might matter.
I can imagine someone thinking, okay, fine, we should be polite to some degree because that's the price we pay to live in a system of minimal individual harm. Civilities and manners are the rules we follow to stay out of each other's way. But if I understand you and in your argument, you take that to reflect an overly individualistic conception of humans. We are far more interdependent than that would suggest. For example, you write, we are born human, we might say, but we are given our humanity by and with others. And in your view, learning and practicing civility and good manners plays a role in this. So how does that work exactly?
Yeah, I think that all of us are going to come to ourselves by way of other people. We in a thin biological sense, we're born human, but our ability to form friendships, have relationships, cooperate towards shared ends, have meaningful interaction with other human beings. Those are all things that we learn from others, and we learn from the patterning they present us with. So that, to the extent that we are attentive to the moods and emotions of other people in a way that facilitates our companionship with them. We learn that from people being attentive and considerate of our own moods as youngsters and so on. I think as children and, throughout our lives, we rely on other people in ways both material and symbolic. And we also historically and developmentally rely on them for, our sense of what the world is like, what human beings are capable of, what's possible for us. And so I think that manners is not, for the Confucians, and I would agree, is not, sort of about ways to leave each other alone. Inevitably, it's about whether and how we will form bonds with each other. And I agree with Shunzi here in the sort of more negative case. It's like we're bound to other people whether we like it or not. Our dependencies don't. People talk now about bubbles and silos and ways that we cut ourselves off from other parts of the population and so forth. But we live in a world where you can do that to some extent, but you cannot do it finally. And better to figure out how to interact with each other and how to cooperate with each other.
Yeah, on that note about bubbles and silos, I'm thinking about how you talked about part of your inspiration for the book had to do with how ugly some of the political discourse was during the time the book was forming. I can imagine some people hearing what you're arguing, still being skeptical. I mean, if we're talking about, political discourse specifically, they might be thinking like, look, my ideological opponents, they're just ruthless. They're just nasty. They're just plain uncivil. And being civil to them is just asking to lose ground or to lose face or just to lose. Maybe being rude is the moral low ground, but being rude just seems like the winning strategy. Now, you address this, and I think this might be my very favorite part of your book. You argue that civility and good manners can be weaponized in a way that disarms people who are being uncivil. Can you talk about how you use both Confucius and Michelle Obama as examples of how being civil to the uncivil is not like, as you put it, the proverbial stick at a gunfight?
Yeah, I mean, I think that they're, especially in contexts where rudeness and incivility are, fly fast and free. Restraint has a uncommon power. And so exercising restraint in dissent from others is incredibly powerful in contexts like that. So, with Confucius, he's talking to a warlord who, is a thief. He's corrupt and so forth. And he's worried about, thieves in his area, his province, and wants to know how to stop them. And, Confucius just sort of sticks the, kind of, it's that kind of civility can be kind of an assassin's blade up the sleeve. It's subtle and you don't know you've been struck till the assassin is long gone. But, Confucius just says something about, if the ruler, he wouldn't have to worry about thievery if he would just, kind of contain his own selfish desires. And he uses a kind of historical exemplar to demonstrate this. And I think that idea that one is restrained and that you will not stoop can itself function as simultaneously a condemnation and a summons to other people to rise. So yeah, I mean, I should have probably brought in an example of like a more contemporary example of it, but I just think
what was the case with Michelle Obama?
Oh, with Michelle Obama, right? I mean, this is where she says, when they go low, we go high. And when she says that, she's repudiating the people who have, this is in the context of her personally having been treated shabbily by critics and having horrible things said about her. And a kind of refusal to engage with that, while also engaging it to dismiss it and to say, in effect, I'm going to consider this beneath my explicit address, right? I'm not going to address it directly. And I want to attest that, we go high, and that we is powerful too, because she's implicitly saying to people who agree with her, right, stick with me here, right? Stay with me on this. And so it's a way of calling someone low and contrasting yourself with them, asserting a kind of superiority, but it's done impeccably politely, and it's done in defense of politeness. And I think that those kinds of responses are possible, right? Where we can simply decline to be rude, and you can decline to be rude in ways that effectively rebuke the one being rude. And I also think, one of the things that is attached to this that I think is one of the most unfortunate mistakes in our cultural discussion around civility is we seem to have this readiness to think about incivility as hand in hand with dissent. And civility is complicity, going along with things. And there's no need for those. You can dissent civilly or uncivilly. Right? There's no reason to think that dissent needs to be uncivil. And I think that one of the things that you get with a commitment to civility is you have to get creative in your dissent. And that can be very useful, especially in a context where incivility flows freely. Because to my mind, in our contemporary experience, incivility doesn't even draw notice anymore because it's so commonplace. It's more arresting and more striking when someone is practicing civility than incivility. So if part of your goal is to secure people's attention to your values, doing it civilly might actually be more effective than otherwise.
So you wrote this book almost 5 years ago. You've talked about how the 2016 election, in part, kind of inspired the way the shape of the book ended up playing out. What about now? How do things look in the rearview mirror? Do things seem better, worse? Are they the same, maybe different? Give us your analysis of how things have transpired since the publication of your book.
Yeah, I mean, I think in the last years, things have gotten worse. The explanations for that, I would love to read what historians say figuring out this period 50 years from now. I won't live that long, but I really do think that there are some historians down the road who are going to have a really interesting time analyzing this period and what exactly happened. I do think things are worse. I think some of that has to do with the social media, internet, information silos, that we don't even agree on the same information sources. Affective polarization is worse than it was when I started this. And I don't know how we get out of it, but it does seem to me that I sure would like to see the ship turning the other way. I'm not sure we're there yet, though.
Well, we save our very most important question for the very end of the podcast that we like to ask every guest.
This is a high stakes question, by the way.
Uh-oh,
So,
okay.
Yeah.
Do you want me to? Okay, so I have the honors this time. If after this podcast, after you sign off, and if you had only these two choices, you could leave the podcast and either go immediately watch an episode of Seinfeld or an episode of 30 Rock. Which one of those would you choose?
I don't think I've seen 30 Rock enough to make the choice. I think I've only seen like a clip of it once, maybe. So I don't know. I guess Seinfeld, because it's the only one I've seen.
Seinfeld is the only option left. Yes, that's right.
Defeat. This is our perennial debate between James and I. Which of those comedies?
You know what would be interesting, though?
Could I choose Parks and Rec instead?
I would be okay with that. That would be a slight victory for me, because that's probably my number 2 favorite comedy.
We only give 2 options.
I know.
Now, I will say you would be interesting to do a study of those 2 shows through the lens of civility.
Oh, it would be.
And see what you came up with, right? What are lessons that could or could not be drawn from those, right?
That would be good. That would be good.
Well, our guest today has been Dr. Amy Olberding. We have been reviewing her book, The Wrong of Rudeness. Dr. Olberding, thank you for joining us today.
Thanks so much for being here.
Thank y'all for having me.
And we will see everyone next time. Bye-bye.
Thanks for listening to Curiosity Porn with the 2 best intellectual pole dancers in the United States, Dr. Guy Crane and Professor James Davenport. If you'd like to share a comment about today's episode, suggest a guest or topic, or just leave a compliment or complaint, you can reach us at curprn@gmail.com. We hope to hear from you.